So once again, I have the great privilege of introducing you to a Native person that I bet you don't know. If you're Canadian, I bet you do know her. Her name is Pauline Johnson. She took the name Tekahionwake, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So I'm going to go over this every time because this area of Native American culture is so fraught. So I want us to kind of just remember some things and expand upon some things as we undertake this study and these discussions. So this is different from studying the Vedas or the Dhammapada or the Tao Te Ching or anything else. It's different from anything because we're standing upon the land of the people, of Native people. And if you don't acknowledge that, if you don't take that into account, then you haven't really begun to understand. This is not our land. It is the land that was inhabited by people 10,000 years before us or more. And their stories continue, and they continue. And so we want to mark that in all our discussions and in all my lectures. Land was not simply property. For Native people is not simply property, it is place. It is the creator, the generator of mythology and ritual and the entire worldview, which is that you are blessed to live on this planet, and this planet is more important than you. And if you need any evidence of that, it was here long before you came, and it will be here long after the coronavirus takes its toll. The land will be here. We will not. And of course, land and language make place. Language is very important here. You'll see that I am careful to use the native names, the tribal names of the writers that we're talking about tonight whenever possible, because and I don't want you to feel bad about these things if you don't know these things, because I don't think guilt, what does George Michael say? Guilty feelings got no rhythm. That's so true. Guilty feelings do not have rhythm. I don't think guilt's a useful emotion for anything. I'm not talking about you feeling guilty for being white or whatever. I just want you to understand, and I want us to understand that there's a history here. And it's a painful one for Euro-Americans and for Native people. And we should acknowledge that as well, because there's a temptation here, and there's a temptation, frankly, in institutions like this one, to take, again, the wisdom that is clearly there in Native cultures and just appropriate it for yourself. And we're not going to do that in this series. We're going to try very hard not to do that. And this is how you try not to do that, is you contextualize in terms of history and land and language. But it happens all the time, and it shouldn't. Again, this is not for you to feel guilty about. This is for you to know about. So why do this at all? Why even venture into this fraught area? Because Native people are speaking, and they've been speaking for a long time, and they're speaking to the larger culture. They're speaking to Euro-American culture, to the dominant culture. And they're saying things that we would not otherwise hear. If we did not have their voices, we wouldn't hear these things, and we wouldn't have the wisdom that comes from their reflecting upon the dominant culture, our culture, and what it has done to them. But it's more than that. That's like the first step, to say, hey, this happened. What's really interesting, and I think you saw it with Zikala Shah, and you will see it tonight with Pauline Johnson, is the response to hegemony, is the response to losing your culture, potentially losing your culture through very direct and brutal means, and survival. Which I mentioned last time, Gerald Visner, the wonderful Anishinaabe critics, calls survivance, because it's survival and resistance. So this is, for me, and this is my scholarly field, is Native American literature and religion. For me, it's always been an act of listening. They're speaking. How do I listen? How do I listen well? How do I listen recognizing the importance of land, language, history, the dangers of appropriation, etc.? And one of the ways to do that, one of the more prominent and problematic ways of listening, is to say, oh, that's just like this, and I know this, so this is the same. It's never the same, right? So it's a common issue that we deal with all the time, is similarity and difference. And that's fine, because we are here to hear Native wisdom. We're not here to overlay Native wisdom with our preconceived notions of what wisdom is. We're here to listen. This goes back to listening. And so, yes, are there things for us to apply? Yes, absolutely, but we have to do a little work first. Joseph Campbell talked about universal ideas, and that's what he's known for, the hero's journey that you find in every heroic story. And that's great, but people forget, he also talked about it's great to have a universal idea, but Campbell and this anthropologist whose name I can't remember, always grounded it in ethnic notions, he called it. That is land and place and language of the time. Otherwise, it's so seductive to just pull this out and say, this applies to me here and now. And it wasn't meant for you. It may apply, but it wasn't meant for you. And the most common example of this is the Bible. The Bible wasn't meant for Americans, I'm sorry. It was written by and for nomadic peoples in the Hebrew Bible, and for an occupied, oppressed people in the New Testament. Has nothing to do with us, I'm sorry. So you can take things out of it, usually works really poorly. You end up with some weird stuff. One of my colleagues was Rabbi Balinson, and I used to go to his temple, and they would always say, dear God, help us understand what you meant for nomadic peoples, 4,000 years ago. Help us understand what that means for us today, because we don't know. Okay, enough of that. So E. Pauline Johnson was Mohawk, and there is the general area that is the Mohawk. They are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Means people who build the house, and so they were known for their long houses. So this was an alliance of, and the Mohawk are known as people of the Flint, by the way. But this was an alliance of 6 nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later Tuscarora. And so a really amazing confederacy here that was, in fact, democratic before there was an America. So it's, in fact, Jefferson and I think Ben Franklin visited with these chiefs and helped form the American democracy based on some of these ideas from the Iroquois Council. This is Tekahionwake's, sorry, I'm going to get this wrong. Tekahionwake's, E. Pauline Johnson's people. They are the Mohawk. So if there's a chance, I'm always going to let you hear a story. And here's a wonderful Mohawk storyteller.
And that's the beginning, as Van Morrison says, of the healing. And the healing has begun when we start to sing our song. Can you share a Mohawk story about healing?
A very important story to us is not just to the Mohawk, but to the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations, and also the Tuscarora people, has to do with our history. There was a time in our history when those nations were fighting with one another. It was a terrible time, a time of darkness, of sorrow, of anger, of discontent, disharmony. But then a man that we refer to as the peacemaker came to us with a message of peace and unity. Actually, the story takes a long time to tell, so again, I'm shortening it up a bit. And he convinced those nations to unify into a peace confederacy. When the peacemaker tried to convince all of these nations, these 5 nations, that peace was a good idea, he gave us symbols to help us remember how this would work, because it would be very easy for us to revert to our old ways if we didn't have those symbols. We might forget the story. We might forget how this was going to work. And so what he did was he went to a white pine tree. And a white pine grows very tall and very straight. You can see it from a long ways off. And if you look at a white pine, the needles grow in groups of 5. Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, as opposed to other pine trees. And what he did was, and that tree is green, it's vital all year round. And he uprooted symbolically that tree, and he asked the people to throw their weapons of war into the pit. And they say that at the bottom of that pit was an underground stream that would carry those weapons away so that future generations would not see them. That's where the expression "bury the hatchet" comes from.
No kidding.
And then that tree that we refer to as the Great Tree of Peace was put back into the ground, and we say that it has 4 white roots of peace that extend north, south, east, and west to the ends of Turtle Island of North America, as an invitation to other peoples who want to seek sanctuary or peace. They can symbolically follow those roots back to the Great Tree of Peace and find protection there under the branches of that tree. And then an eagle was put on top of that tree, because an eagle has keen eyesight and can fly high. That eagle can see everything that's going on and warn us of any impending dangers to that peace. He's our guardian. And so you see that symbol of the Great Tree of Peace with the 4 white roots of peace and the eagle on top in a lot of our artwork. And so my uncle, Julius Cook, he was a silversmith, and he decided, wouldn't it be wonderful to put some of our symbols into this form of jewelry? And he would actually use these as teaching devices when he would go and meet with people to teach us about our traditions and our history and our stories. So yes, you see again here that Great Tree of Peace with the 4 white roots of peace. If you look carefully, the weapons are buried underneath and the eagle is on top. And that's one of the symbols. We have lots of symbols about how this works to remind us to tell these stories, to keep that hope for peace alive so we don't forget.
All right, so who was Tekahionwake? Pauline Johnson? I found an old Canadian documentary, and I thought this little scene described it best.
Did you ever hear of Pauline Johnson?
Can't say I have. She live in these parts?
Oh, my dear. Pauline Johnson was a poetess.
That explains everything.
You know, I think perhaps she's my favorite Canadian writer. She died 20 years ago. She was part Indian, you know. Dream of tender gladness, of filmy sun and opal-tinted skies, of warm midsummer air that lightly lies in mystic rings.
Pretty campy stuff, even for the 1930s.
Indeed. So here she is, Tekahionwake. Her name, like Zakala Shah, she took this name on, right? Zakala Shah did it in her teens. Pauline Johnson does it as part of, well, it's her stage name, actually. And you'll see what that means exactly. It means double wampum, or by implication, double life. Double life. Born 1861, died 1913. Has the official designation in Canada of person of national historic significance. Again, that's why I said if Canadians were here, they would know who we were talking about, most Canadians. If you've ever been to Stanley Park in Vancouver, one of my favorite parks in the world, so good. She's buried there. And she has a monument. I think I have an image of it later on. This was never heard of. You don't bury people in a city park. But, well, with officially, you don't do that. Who knows what's in Griffith Park? She was born in Middleport, Ontario, or what is now Middleport, Ontario, on the Six Nations Reserve. She had a British mother of a certain class and a Mohawk father of an equal class. We'll talk about that in a minute. He was well respected by whites and the Six Nations people, and her mother was a Victorian British woman. And they made this interesting union of nations and genders and all kinds of traditions. They made it work as best they could, and actually very well. So she had an Anglican education. Her mother was Anglican. But she was also the granddaughter of Chief John Smoke Johnson, a great Mohawk leader, and then his son, Pauline's father. Also very well known, very well respected among the Confederacy and also the whites. They were loyalists, so they fought for the British. I believe John Smoke Johnson was responsible for burning down the city of Buffalo in the 19th century on behalf of the British. Oh yeah, there's the monument in Stanley Park. Yeah, amazing. So you see this confluence of her parents, and she was a British loyalist and a Canadian loyalist, but she was also a native, a proud Mohawk. And she will say in many of her works, they think I'm all these things, but they forget that I am a woman. She usually grouped in Canadian literary history among the Confederation poets because she was a nationalist, meaning she wrote basically patriotic poetry, very moving to people in this emerging Canada. Right? Her first performance, she was a performer. We should think of her as mainly a performance artist. So she performed her poetry, and in the first instance of this that really got a lot of attention was at a club in Toronto called the Young Men's Liberal Association, which is a great name. 1892. Held at the Toronto Art School Gallery. She was the only woman at the event, an overflow crowd, some other very well-known writers there. And one of the reviews reads this way: "The poise and grace of this beautiful young woman standing before them captivated the audience even before she began to recite, not read as the others had done, her Cry from an Indian Wife poem. Again, we've got to think of her as a performance artist. So the other guys are up there reading, as poets do. It's fine. But E. Pauline Johnson performs. And not only that, she was called back for an encore at the Young Men's Liberal Association. Apparently, this begins her long stage career. Now, her name means double wampum, double life. She embraced that. She embraced this, what W.B. Du Bois called double consciousness for black folk, as he called them. She embraced this. She leaned into it, we would say today, and exploited it and subverted it. We saw that with Zikala Shah last time. We're going to see it all through as a reaction to the dominant culture is you can say, this is terrible, this is horrible, and they did, but the writers, the artists among Native people used it and made it much more powerful because of that. So she was, of course, seen as an Indian princess because that was the prevailing stereotype at the time, and maybe still is, I don't know. But she obviously looked a little different from her other Canadian friends. So, again, I say she leaned into this. So what she would do is she would have a two-part performance. She would come out as Tekahionwake, dressed in Mohawk. Actually, it wasn't Mohawk. It was, and this is another thing we keep seeing, it was some native dress she had picked up somewhere, right? Doesn't matter, because to her white audience, it's all Native American, right? And so it doesn't matter that it's not tribal, her tribe, or any tribe even. She gave them the stereotype that they wanted to see. It was a pastiche, a bunch of Indian stuff. But she also included some other artifacts, material cultural items from her grandfather, such as a wampum belt and some spiritual masks, etc. And during this part of her performance, she would recite dramatic Indian lyrics, and then there would be intermission, and she would go back and change, and she came out as a proper Victorian English woman. And she represented that to her audience too. She changed her voice, she changed her clothes, she changed her poetry, and it was classic Victorian poetry, very dripping with sentimentality, and I don't mean that as a cut. You heard some of it there in the little movie clip. So people loved this. They went crazy for it. It was exactly what they wanted to hear at this time and in this place. They wanted to see a Native person, right? Because they were disappearing. Buffalo Bill Cody made tons of money off this notion. Even had Sitting Bull in his show, right? People wanted this because, as Jean Baudrillard notes, when something is gone, that's when the reality is gone, he says, that's when nostalgia emerges and takes its full force. You can only be nostalgic about something that you think is gone. Well, people just love this. And so she saw it, and she's like, all right, let's make a little money off this. So hers was a commercialized life. And frankly, she has received some criticism of that, for that among critics, because that's what they do, is criticize. It's not a trivial issue to have a Mohawk woman kind of passing. In African American culture, you would call that passing. As a white woman, but she was a white woman. She was the daughter of an English woman. And again, she jumps right into that liminal zone and just plays with it. And I don't mean to imply that she made a lot of money from it, but she was really popular and made some money, but then of course she had to. And I'll talk about that in a minute, maybe. So there is a critical perspective on E. Pauline Johnson's life because of her use of stereotypes. Okay, that's fair. We can talk about that. But again, here's what usually gets missed, even though it's a refrain in her work. This is about being a woman. Sure, it's about being British and or Canadian. Sure, it's about being Mohawk and being the granddaughter of one of the most famous Mohawk chiefs. But in story after story, she says, but I'm also a woman. And again, this is before women had the vote in the United States. I don't know when they got it in Canada. She says this, women are fonder of me than men are. I have had none fail me, and I hope I have failed none. It is a keen pleasure for me to meet a congenial woman, one that I feel will understand me, and will in turn let me peep into her own life, having confidence in me that this is one of the dearest things between friends, strangers, acquaintances, or kindred. She eventually moved to Vancouver. That's how she ended up in Stanley Park. And she had fallen upon hard times. Well, I'll just go ahead and tell you, her father died. And again, very respectable Mohawk chief, translator, liaison between the Six Nations and the white community in Canada and in America. And once he had created this house called Chief's Wood that her mother and sisters had to not abandon, they had to lease it out. Because once he was gone, and this was the case, of course, for most of American and Canadian history, that when a woman lost, world history, when a woman lost her husband, she lost her protection and she lost her means. And so you have, for example, in the New Testament, St. Paul urging the churches to take care of the widows, right? Because they had no protection. Muhammad was a great reformer in this way for Islam, is, hey, we've got to protect the women, especially the widows who have no protection or means after their husbands die. Is really interesting reason for that, because of course he was married to a woman 15 years older than he, a wealthy woman named Khadijah, but we're not talking about Islam tonight. She died of breast cancer. She had fallen, stopped performing, had fallen ill, and some friends of hers gathered, and she needed money for health care. And so they got together and published some of her poems. Now you're going to see in the next slide her works. You're just not going to believe it. So they had plenty to work with, and they gathered them together in these various volumes, and that kind of provoked a resurgence in her Canadian and American profile, and then not long after she died. When she died in Vancouver, people lined the streets at her funeral. She was and is a Canadian hero, still recognized today. In fact, she was, you saw on the opening slide, that was a mock-up for her being on a Canadian bill. She didn't get that, another woman got it, but she was seriously considered to be on Canadian money. She's on a Canadian stamp. All right, so I'm gonna let this play. This is a list of her writings, and it's just gonna keep going as I talk. This is from a great book called Paddling Her Own Canoe, The Times and Texts of E. Pauline Johnson by Carol Gerson and Victoria Strong-Boag. So here are the general works. The White Wampum, 1895, Legends of Vancouver, 1911. These latter two here are the ones that her friends put together. Flint and Feather. The authors of this book say that the contents of this autobiography that they put together, because no one had ever done this before, she wrote too much. You couldn't track it all down. And she was writing in newspapers in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and she just kept writing, and they still can't find it all. But these pages scrolling through, that's her work. They say this: Pauline Johnson was a complicated, contentious, and passionate personality whose life blurs the borders of what it means to be Native, woman, and Canadian. So, let's hear her voice. Let's hear some of this poetry. Again, which was written to be performed, as the earliest poetry was, as Mandy Kahn's poetry is written, I think, to be performed, to be enacted, to be embodied. So you're going to hear late Victorian or Victorian genres of romance and sentimentality, but you're also going to hear what the writers of that book I just mentioned call her development of the female gaze. Okay, so you may know about the male gaze, which is men looking upon women and writing about looking upon women and writing about looking upon women. Pauline Johnson developed what they call the female gaze, and I love this because it's absolutely right. Here's just a taste. A thin, wet sky that yellows at the rim and meets with sun-lost lip the marsh's brim. The pools low-lying, dank with moss and mold, glint through their mildews like large cups of gold. So it's couplets, right? Which I hate, but it was really popular then. Among the wild rice in the still lagoon, in monotone, the lizard shrills his tune. The wild goose homing seeks a sheltering where rushes grow and oozing lichens cling. Lake cranes with heavy wing and lazy flight sail up the silence with the nearing night. And like a spirit swathed in some soft veil, steals twilight and its shadows o'er the swale. Hushed lie the sedges and the vapors creep, thick and gray and humid, while the marshes sleep. Nice, right? Very good poetry. She also wrote erotic poetry. Yeah. Listen to this. This is Victorian, native, Mohawk, Canadian poetry. So silently we two lounge in our canoe, nor fate, nor fortune matters to us now, so long as we alone may call this dream our own. The breeze may die, the sail may droop, we care not when or how. Against the thwart nearby, inactively you lie, and all too near my arm your temple bends. Your indolently crude, abandoned attitude is one of ease and art, in which a perfect languor blends. Your costume, loose and light, leaves unconcealed your might of muscle. Half suspected, half defined, and falling well aside, your vesture opens wide. And above your sunburnt throat that pulses unconfined. Wait, I lost my place. With easy unreserve, across the gunnel's curve, your arm is lying brown and bare. Your hand just touches mine. With import firm and fine, I kiss the very wind that blows about your tumbled hair. Ah, dear, I am unwise in echoing your eyes whenever they leave their far-off gaze and turn to melt and blur my sight. For every other light is servile to your cloud-gray eyes, wherein cloud shadows burn But once the silence breaks, once your ardor wakes, the words that humanize this lotus land, so perfect and complete, those burning words and sweet, so perfect is the single kiss your lips lay on my hand. The paddles lie disused. The fitful breeze abused has dropped to slumber with no afterblow. And hearts will pay the cost, for you and I have lost more than the homeward blowing wind that died an hour ago. You okay? All right. So just a couple of stories from her. She also wrote short stories, and they are so incredibly powerful. And here's one called A Red Girl's Reasoning. So it opens with a guy named Jimmy Robinson talking to a young man who's about to marry a Mohawk girl. And he says, look, you don't understand these Indians as I do. And Charlie, the young boy, is listening. Be good to her, Jimmy says. Charlie, my boy, or she'll balk, sure as shooting. This is what we call foreshadowing in literature. All right, so you don't understand these Indians as I do. And Charlie, being a young man in love, says, hey, I'm doing all right. Step off. I'm doing pretty well. And Jimmy is having none of it because old men are supposed to tell young boys that they don't know what they're talking about. And so this is what Jimmy does. He said, I tell you, youngster, be careful. It is kindness for kindness, bullet for bullet, and blood for blood. Remember, what you are, she will be. And Charlie MacDonald had a happy, fair face. This is always the white males in her work. They're always these cherubic-like figures who are adorable, beautiful, and stupid. He says, he's described as having eyes that laughed out of the very sunniness of their owner's soul. Okay. So that's Charlie. Now there's Christine. Christine is the native woman, and the text reads, she belonged to neither culture. The text reads, the girl had a fair common education and the native adaptability to progress. All right, so native adaptability to progress, that is not something a native person would call it, right? So this is a very much a Euro-American, Canadian perspective that we can clean her up and straighten her out, all right? And what a great virtue you have, right? So it's very patronizing and pedantic. But the text, the narrator here says, she belonged to neither one of those. Neither one of her native traditions nor this stereotype. The solemn, silent, almost heavy manner of the one so commingled with the gesticulating Frenchness and the vivacity of the other, that one unfamiliar with native Canadian life would find it difficult to determine her nationality. So this is what happens when you play the doubles, right? A third thing comes into being because it has to, right? So, well, I guess it doesn't have to. You can choose one or the other. You can choose the Mohawk Indian princess, E. Pauline Johnson, or you can choose the Victorian British woman, E. Pauline Johnson. But she won't let you do that unless you're being really stupid. She's going to create this dichotomy, which in itself creates a third kind of thing that you have to use to try to understand it. So she always does this. She plays the doubles in her work, demanding that the reader either transcend or recognize the futility of these dichotomies. So, I forgot to There's the doubles. All right, so what we've got here is a classic E. Pauline Johnson situation, much of it autobiographical. So she had many suitors throughout her life, usually white men. Was engaged once even, but never married, never had children. The doubles. So they go. Charlie is the fiancé. Christine is his bride-to-be. They go now into a social situation. Charlie's family is well off, and so he's introducing his bride to not only his parents who know her, but to the social circle in which they live and move. So she approaches her with her husband, Logan. And she says, "How interesting. Do tell us more of your old home, Mrs. McDonald. Tell me of your old home, Mrs. McDonald. You so seldom speak of your life at the post on the reserve. And we fellows so often wish to hear of it all." Sorry, this is Logan. Logan said eagerly. "Why do you not ask me of it then?" She says, "Okay, ask me. What do you want to know?" And he starts to stumble. "Well, I'm sure I don't know. I'm fully interested in your people. I mean, your mother's people. But it always seems so personal, I suppose." And he's stammering. And Christine McDonald says, "Perhaps you are, like all other white people, afraid to mention my nationality to me." The captain winced. Captain Logan and his wife, Mrs. Stewart, laughed uneasily. And I'll summarize the story. They continue talking, and Christine McDonald mentions that, let me just read it to you. Yeah, Christine says, "My father often teases my mother now about how very native she was when he married her. Then how could she have been otherwise? She did not know a word of English, and there was not another English-speaking person besides my father and his two companions within 60 miles. And a pall falls on the room. Here's why. 2 companions? One a Catholic priest and the other a wine merchant, maybe, I suppose. And with your father and Hudson Bay, they were good representatives of pioneers in the New World," remarked Logan. "Oh no," Christine says, "they were all Hudson Bay men. There were no rum sellers and no missionaries in that part of the country." Uh-oh. Ms. Stewart looked puzzled. "No missionaries?" Christine's insight was quick, the text reads. There was a peculiar expression of interrogation in the eyes of her listeners, and the girl's blood leapt angrily into her temples as she said hurriedly, "I know what you mean. I know what you're thinking. You were wondering how my parents were married." "Well, yes, my dear, it does seem peculiar. If there was no priest, no magistrate, why..." Miss Stewart paused awkwardly. "The marriage was performed according to Indian ritual," Christine says. And then Logan says, "Oh, do tell," he's trying to rescue this situation. "Oh, do tell me about it. The ceremony is very interesting and quaint. Are your chieftains like Buddhist priests?" Well, no, they're not. There's that issue I was talking about, right? That issue of appropriation. So there's no ceremony, there's just a big meal, and people just agree to live together and for each other, and then the man takes the woman back to his teepee or house. There's no ritual to bind them, they need none. An Indian's word is his bond, at least in those days. Mrs. Stewart stepped backwards. And did Mr. McDonald marry you in this way?" "Oh no, we were married by Father O'Leary. Why do you ask?" "Because if he'd had," Logan says, "I would have blown his brain out tomorrow." "Captain Logan," she said, "what dare you say to me? What dare you mean? Do you presume to think it would not have been lawful for Charlie to marry me according to my people's rights? Do you for one instant dare to question my parents were not as legally," and she's going to say married as you are, but she's interrupted by Mrs. Stewart, who says, "It's bad enough now. Goodness knows, don't make it worse." Logan, trying to save the situation, still tries to pull Mrs. Stewart away for a waltz. And she says, "It is shocking." She says this out loud into a very, quiet parlor. "Outrageously shocking. I wonder if they told Mr. MacDonald before he married her." Then looking hurriedly around, she too saw the young husband's face and knew that they had not. So Charlie MacDonald is just learning that his bride's parents were not married according to Catholic law. They go back to the hotel, and Christine says, or Charlie says, "Christine, do you know what you've done?" And she says, "Yes, I have angered you, Charlie." "No, you have disgraced me." "Angered me. You have disgraced me. And moreover, you have disgraced yourself and your parents." "Disgraced?" "Yes, disgraced. You have literally declared to the whole city that your father and mother were never married, and that you are the child of, what shall we call it, love?" Certainly not legality, because what's more important here? The text reads, "The voice was like an angry demon's. Not a trace was there of the yellow-haired, blue-eyed, laughing-lipped boy who had driven away so gaily to the dance 5 hours before." "Shame," Christine says. "Why should I be ashamed of the rights of my people any more than you should be ashamed of the customs of yours, of a marriage more sacred and holy than half your white man's mockeries?" The girl, Christine, turns upon him. They continue this fight. And she turns upon him and says, "Do you suppose," she hissed, "that my mother would be married according to your white rights after she had been 5 years a wife? And that I had been born in the meantime? No, 1,000 times I say no." When the priest came with his notions of Christianizing and talked to them of remarriage by the church, my mother arose and said, "Never, never, I have never had but this one husband. He has none but me for wife, and to have to remarry us would be to say as much to the whole world that we had never been married before. You go away. I do not ask that your people be remarried. Talk not so to me. I am married, and you or the church cannot undo it." This is her mother. And then this is the climax of the story. This is Christine. "Stop," she said. He's approaching her, and she says, "Stop," outstretching her palms against him as he sprang to his feet. "I tell you, we are not married. Why should I recognize the rights of your nation when you do not acknowledge the rights of mine? According to your own words, my parents should have gone through your church ceremony as well as through an Indian contract. According to my words, we should go through an Indian contract as well as through a church marriage. If their union is illegal, so is ours. If you think my father is living in dishonor with my mother, my people will think I am living in dishonor with you. How do I know when another nation will come and conquer you, as you white men conquered us? And they will have another marriage rite to perform. And they will tell us another truth, that you are not my husband, that you are but disgracing and dishonoring me, that you are keeping me here not as your wife, but as your squaw." She leaves and goes back to the reserve. Not before she leaves his brother a note. His brother's been a part of it. I haven't included him in the story, but his brother, Charlie's brother, is right there. And, well, let me just hear this. He's like in the room across. Dear old Joel, she writes to his brother, I went into your room at daylight to get that picture of the post on your bookshelves. I hope you don't mind, but I kissed your hair while you slept. It was so curly and yellow and soft, just like his. Goodbye, Joe. Christy. So, you know what happens, right? This is a white guy, so he goes in pursuit of her. This is just a guy. I shouldn't even say white guy. This is just a guy, so he goes in pursuit of her and finds her and has these notions in his head of this great reconciliation, because after all, he's come all the way from Toronto to this backwoods Mohawk reserve. Of course, she will take him back. And she says, no, I do not like you. Amazing. And of course, I'm not doing it justice because there's a lot of scene setting here and drama building to the end. I do not like you, she answered quietly. God, oh God, what is there left? She did not appear to hear the heartbreak in his voice. She did not appear to hear the heartbreak in his voice. She stood like one wrapped in somber thought, no blaze, no tear, nothing in her eyes, no hardness, no tenderness about her mouth. The wind was blowing her cloak aside, and the only visible human life in her whole body was once when he spoke, the muscles of her brown arm seemed to contract. Oh my God, that's so brutal, right? She just stands there and there's just you can just see a little twitch to know that she's alive. Is it all useless? Is it all useless, Christine? He said with his lips starving for hers. All useless. I have no love for you now. You forfeited me and my heart months ago when you said those two words. His arms fell away from her wearily, and he arose mechanically, and there's a long, long description of him leaving. She was conscious, the text reads, of but two things: the vengeful lie in her soul, and a little space on her arm that his wet lashes had brushed. And it ends with him going back to the hotel room to talk to his brother. And here's the last line of the story. He's crying, he's weeping, he's dying, She won't respond to him. And he's broken down on the floor, saying, oh God, dear God, I thought you loved me. Now he's blaming God. Right? I thought you'd let me have her again, but you must be tired of me, tired of loving me too, God. I've nothing left now, nothing. It doesn't seem right that I even have you tonight. Really? He lifted his face then, for his dog, big and clumsy and yellow, was licking at his sleeve. End of story. Brutal, just brutal. I'll finish with this little story, and this is one of my favorite stories ever. As it was in the beginning, I said last time, and we'll hear this again, that Native people, Native writers, especially engage the Genesis story because that's the story that motivates white people then and now, is this sense of, and part of the Genesis story is that God gives Adam and Eve the land and the languages to have dominion over it. So it's not surprising that Native people would pick up on that because they were the victims of that edict to have dominion over the land. And we can read about Euro-Americans coming to this continent and invoking that, absolutely invoking that. And so Native people were treated as part of nature, as part of the land, and so you clear the land, you clear the people because they're not really people. So this is an amazing little short story that takes on that Genesis story and does what Native writers do, subverts it powerfully. So, opening line. They account for it by the fact that I am a redskin, but I am something else too. I am a woman. So what happens is a black coat comes, a missionary comes to the Cree Nation this time, and asked to take this little girl away. See, we saw that happen. That happened with Tekahionwake. It happened frequently. The father the text reads, sat in the teepee polishing buffalo horns and smoking, and allowed this man to come into their home because hospitality is paramount among the virtues of this tribe. The text reads, the trappers explained to my father who he was, the great teacher, the heart's medicine man, the black coat we had all heard of, who brought peace when there was war, and the magic of those whose black book brought greater things than all the happy hunting grounds of our ancestors. Now, that she knows that's not a thing, happy hunting grounds. That's a white thing, but she's put it in this story to mess with us, all right? The missionary, the black coat, pleads with the father to let him take this young girl. The mother is having none of it. This is a common refrain, is the mother is resisting, the father is acceding to these demands, but the mothers are always resisting. And she speaks up as this conversation is going on between these two men. She speaks up and says, look, if the white man made this black coat's hell, let him go to it. It is for the man who found it first. No hell for Indians, just happy hunting grounds. Black coat can't scare me. Then after a week, the text reads, then after weeks had passed, one day as he stood at the teepee door, he laid his old white hand on my head and said to my father, give me this little girl, chief. And that's how they would put it. Let me take her to the mission school. Let me keep her and teach her the great God and his eternal heaven. She will grow to be a noble woman and return perhaps to bring her people to Christ. My mother's eyes snapped no. It was the first word she had ever spoken to the black coat. My father sat and smoked. At the end of a half hour, he said, I'm an old man, black coat. I shall not leave the God of my fathers. I like not your strange God's ways, all of them. I like not his 2 new places for me when I am dead. Take the child, nevertheless, black coat, and save her from hell. So they do. They let the black coat take her. And she becomes very quickly the black coat's pet. This is the way she puts it. But as I was his pet, his darling of the whole school, he let me speak of him as I would, knowing it was but my heart speaking in love. She comes to love him as a surrogate father. His sister was a widow and mother to a laughing yellow-haired boy. Here he is, the yellow-haired boy of or about my own age, who was my constant playmate and who taught me much of English in his own childish way. I used to be fond of their child, just as I was fond of his mother and of his uncle, my father Paul, as they called him. But as my girlhood passed away, as womanhood came upon me, I got strangely wearied of them all. I longed, oh God, how I longed for the old wild life. It came with my womanhood, my years. Her name is Esther, by the way, the young girl, which has a lot of resonance in the Hebrew Bible as a woman who's out of place and yet succeeds. And then she notes that they grow up together. And remember that line, it was my womanhood coming, and so sexuality begins to become a part of it. And she writes this, my old child playmate had vanished long ago. He was tall and slender, handsome as a young chief, but with laughing blue eyes and always those yellow curls about his temples. He was my solace in my half-exile, my comrade, my brother. Until one night it was, Esther, Esther, can't I make you happy? I did not answer him. I only looked across the plains and thought of the teepees. He came close, close. He locked his arms about me, and with my face pressed up to his throat, He stood silent. I felt the blood from my heart sweep to my very fingertips. I loved him. Oh God, how I loved him. In a wild, blind instant, it all came just because he held me so and was whispering brokenly, don't leave me, Esther. Esther, my child love, my playmate, my girl comrade, my little Cree sweetheart. Will you go away to your people or stay for me, for my arms, as I have you now? Well, there's a lot more beautiful passages that I have to skip, but they decide to marry. And Father Paul, his uncle, hears of this, and he calls him in, his nephew in. His face was paler, and Esther is watching and listening through the crack in the door. His face was paler than I'd ever seen it, graver. Tell me about this new love. He thinks it's going to be a white girl. You have said nothing of marriage to her? Asked Father Paul. And the boy says, well, no, but she surely understands that we're going to get married because they'd had sex. Did you speak of marriage? Repeated Father Paul with a harsh ring in his voice that was new to me. No, uncle, but very well then, very well. There was a brief silence. Sorry, the young boy's name is Lawrence. I'd forgotten. And Father Paul turns to the window, thinks a long time, and then he turns back to Lawrence. Lawrence, my boy, your future is the dearest thing to me of all earthly interests. You can't marry this girl. No, sit until I have finished, he added with raised voice as Lawrence sprang up, remonstrating, I have long since decided that you will marry well, the Hudson's Bay factor's daughter. Lawrence broke into a fresh, rollicking laugh. What, uncle? Little Ida McIntosh? Marry that little yellow-haired fluffball? That kitten? That pretty little dolly? Stop, Father Paul said. She is white. And then Esther says, Esther writes, the narrator says, my lover started. He jumped at that. And Lawrence says, why, uncle, what do you mean? Only this, my son. Poor Esther comes from uncertain blood. Would it do for you, the missionary's nephew, an adopted son, you might say, marry the daughter of a pagan Indian? Her mother is hopelessly uncivilized. Her father has a dash of French somewhere. Half-breed, you know, my boy, half-breed. Then, with still lower tone and half-shut, crafty eyes, he added, the blood is a bad, bad mixture. You know that. You know that, too, that I'm very fond of the girl. Poor dear Esther, I've tried to separate her from her evil pagan influences. She is the daughter of the church. I want her to have no other parent, but you can never tell what lurks in a caged animal that has once been wild. My whole heart is with the Indian people, my son. My whole heart. My whole life has been devoted to bringing them to Christ, but it is a different thing to marry one of them. I listened, Esther writes, says, sitting like one frozen. Could those words have been uttered by my venerable teacher, by him whom I revered as one of the saints in the Black Book? There was no mistaking it. My white father, my lifelong friend who pretended to love me, to care for my happiness, was urging the man I worshiped to forget me, to marry the factor's daughter because of what? Of my red skin, my good old honest pagan mother, my confiding French Indian father. In a second, all the care, the hollow love he had given me since childhood were as things that never had existed. I hated that old mission priest as I hated his white man's hell. I hated his long white hair. I hated his thin white hands. I hated his body, his soul, his voice, his black book. Oh, how I hated the very atmosphere of him. Lawrence, of course, agrees because he's a young man and he's compelled by his priest uncle. And he ends up saying, you're right. I guess I better not. I'll forget her, and then I'll marry little Ida McIntosh. So Esther thinks for a long time. And then she crept to the closet, she writes, in my dark little room. I felt for a bundle. I had not looked for it for years, but it was there, the buckskin dress I had worn as a little child. When Father Paul brought me to the mission, I tucked it under my arm and descended the stairs noiselessly. I would look into the study and speak goodbye to Lawrence, and then I would go. I pushed open the door. He was lying on the couch where a short time previously he had sat white and speechless, listening to Father Paul. I moved toward him softly. God in heaven, he was already asleep. As I bent over him, the fullness of his perfect beauty impressed me for the first time. His slender form, his curving mouth that almost laughed even in sleep, his fair, tossed hair, his smooth, strong, pulsing throat. God, how I loved him. Then there arose the picture of the daughter, the factor's daughter. I hated her. She goes on and on about how she hates her. She shall not marry him. I will kill him first. His beautiful body, his lying heart. Kill him. She will never have him. Kill him. It will break Father Paul's heart and blight his life. He killed the best of you, of your womanhood. Kill his best, his pride, his hope, his sister's son, the nephew Lawrence. But how? How? What had that terrible old man said about me? I was like a strange snake. Listen to this line. The idea wound itself about me like the very coils of a serpent. What was this in the beaded bag of my buckskin dress? This little thing rolled in tan that my mother had given me at parting with the words, "Don't touch much, but sometime maybe you'll want this." Oh, I knew well enough what it was. A small flint arrowhead dipped in the venom of some strange snake. I knelt beside him and laid my hot lips on his hand. I worshiped him. Oh God, how I worshiped him. Then again, the vision of her baby face, her yellow hair. I scratched his wrist twice with the tip. A single drop of red blood oozed up. He stirred. I turned the lamp down and slipped out of the room, out of the house. I dreamed nightly of the horrors of the white man's hell. Why did they teach me of this, only to fling me into it? Dan Henderson, the trapper, came while I crouched beside my mother on the buffalo hide. He said old Father Paul was bowed with grief and that with my disappearance I was suspected, but that there was no proof. Was it not merely a snake bite? They account for it by the fact that I am a redskin. They seem to have forgotten that I am a woman. What is the wisdom of Tekahionwake? I think there's a lot here. There is learning and loss. She was an educated woman, educated in two traditions at least, maybe more. Surely she picked up things on her travels, but just in her family, she was educated in the great Mohawk tradition and was, frankly, in a privileged situation in both the Mohawk world and in the emerging Canadian world because her mother was British. Learning and loss. She read everything in her mother's library and she wrote very much like British writers. And yet there is what permeates all her writing is the loss. There's doubleness, and then above it is some sort of synthesis, but below it is loss. Painful loss. There's borders and boundaries. We all have to deal with borders, crossing them, and boundaries, transgressing them. She did it in ways that we've never seen before. I think many Native writers will do this. They're navigating these borders and boundaries, but none quite like E. Pauline Johnson, as you may have seen. Borders and boundaries, both fictions and yet quite real in terms of your social and spiritual life. Doubles and dialogues, I love this. I love that she adopts the name double life. I'm going to own this. More than that, I am going to make money from this. I'm going to survive. Again, she's not being greedy. She's trying to survive. Survival, resistance, survivance. Class and convention. You remember last time with Zikala Shah, the Carlisle Indian School just tore her down because she wasn't appreciative of being taken away from her family and educated, and haircut, dress change. She wasn't appreciative of that. E. Pauline Johnson was appreciative of both sides of her heritage, and yet always transcending it to talk about gender. Again, she was like Zikala Shah. She was an early advocate of women's rights. Love and sex. The Victorian cliche is that Victorian writers were afraid of sex, afraid of talking about sex. Michel Foucault dispels that pretty quickly in his History of Sexuality, that there was a robust dialogue about sex. E. Pauline Johnson had every reason not to talk about sex, not to write erotic poetry, and that she did it because there's a certain freedom, I think, in being a double, right? There are many constraints, but there's also a certain freedom, and she explored that freedom erotically. And again, she had all kinds of suitors, never got married, never had a child. And then there's, of course, trickery and transcendence. Trickery as a way to transcendence. And I think that's one of the things we're going to see in all these writers. They are tricksters. Zikala Shah was a trickster. E. Pauline Johnson is a trickster. Wait till you meet Vine Deloria, one of his books is called Custard Died for Your Sins. Through that trickery, on the other side of that trickery, or maybe even embedded into that trickery, is transcendence, a way to go beyond, to live beyond. Survive means to live over, to overlive, right? What a wonderful concept, right? To overlive, to live beyond the life that's been given you by society, by family, by class and convention and gender and borders and boundaries. And that is E. Pauline Johnson, and thank you for letting me introduce you to her.